Yes, thank you. We're going back to a question that we looked at briefly last week that originally came from a question about biologos. This is an article that was recently published on the Biologos website, making this claim that the scientific and historical evidence is now clear. There never has been a global flood that covered the entire Earth, nor do all modern animals and humans descend from the passengers of a single vessel. Now, we had a question about this quite a while ago in 2016, so this has been something that Biologos has been banging on about for a while. And this was the question we had. Biologos stated that Noah's flood was only a local event and is only a theological story. What do we think? Well, you've heard a lot about what we think today and last week. If you missed last week's, there was more interesting evidence for a global flood. But in our question, which you can read on the Ask site, and we won't go into all the details here, but we did raise that there were 5 issues. What did Genesis actually state? Would a local flood make sense? What did Jesus and the apostles teach? And then evidence from world cultures and evidence from the earth. Now, you've heard lots of wonderful evidence from the earth in today's program, and there was some more in last week's program, so do go and have a look at that if you missed it last week. So I just want to briefly look at the second and third part of that of those issues. But first of all, what does Genesis actually state? Well, I suggest you actually read the whole 3 chapters about the flood. Just read it straight through. It is a plain narrative. But one of the key verses, I think, is this, where it says very clearly, the waters prevailed so mightily on the earth that all the high mountains under the whole heaven were covered. Now, we saw some of the mountain. I've been to Tasmania. It's quite a mountainous place. But as Craig showed, evidence that it was underwater. You've seen in the US and in Britain, evidence that high mountains were covered underwater with, and they've left fossils behind as evidence for that. Now, the Biologos article that we recently found also made this claim. Those who say the story portrays a global flood, for instance, are imposing that term on the text because the original audience had no evidence that the earth was a globe. Well, in fact, ancient people did believe the earth was round, and if you go back into our archives, we did do a program on the issue of the flat earth, and we made the point that ancient people knew that the earth was round, and in fact, some of them even set out to measure the diameter. Now, you don't bother to try and measure the diameter of something round if you don't already think that it is round. So do go back and have a look at that program for some more details of that. But let's go to the issue of, if the flood was local, does that make sense in the light of what Genesis actually states? Because there is a lot of detail. In fact, the year of the flood, and it was a year and 10 days, is the most detailed year in the whole Bible, and it's full of facts and figures. It's revolves around Noah's life. In other words, that there is a very clear calendar there, what happened on what day. So let's consider some of the issues. If it was a local flood, does it make any sense? Well, for a start, would you need an ark? If it was a local flood, animals could simply migrate to the next valley in order to escape it, and the birds could fly away from the flood site. Now, that means that more animals and birds could be saved, but the text clearly says that Noah was to take 2 of each kind, or 7 of the clean animals. But if it was a local flood, and remember that it was God who sent the animals to the ark. So if he could send animals to Noah to the ark, he could quite easily send them to migrate into the next valley and tell the birds to fly away from the ark site. And we do need to remember that God said to Noah that he was to take kinds, not species. So how many unique kinds would you have in one local region that would need to be saved if an ark was needed, if there was no way of saving particularly unique kinds in one river valley or one coastal region? So that decreases the number of animals and birds that would need to be saved. So you need to say, well, how big was the ark in order to save the number of unique kinds that you may have in one local region, which would only be a small number. And just as a bit of a diversion, the ark was not a ship. It was actually more like a barge. I mean, well, that was its function. It didn't have to go anywhere. It just had to float. So this is a model that we have in our collection. And this is a photo of it sitting on the ground at Jurassic Ark, actually. But it is a good reminder that the ark was not a ship. It was simply a means of preserving the animal life and Noah's life, so it just had to float. Now, it did have to be seaworthy, but the actual size of the ark, and this is just a model, but if we were to impose the measurements that are given very clearly in the Bible, 140 meters long or 450 feet, and that is the most conservative estimate because the original measurements, of course, are given in cubits. Cubit is about 18 inches at its minimum, but there were various kinds of cubits, and some of them were longer, sacred cubits and royal cubits. So this is the most conservative estimate. Now, that's twice as long as a jumbo jet. That's a seriously big vessel. Okay, 14 meters or 30 feet high and 23 meters or 50 feet wide. And so that is far bigger than you would need just to preserve the unique flora of one river valley, or the unique fauna, rather, of one river valley. Now, we also need to look at the length of the flood. And as I said, it's the most detailed year in the Bible. It clearly states the flood began the 17th day, the second month of Noah's 600th year. And Noah was not told to leave the ark until until a year and 10 days. That is a long, long time. And finally, we have this promise: never again. I will establish my covenant with you that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. Now, if the flood was only regional, there would be quite a lot of people who could rise up and challenge that, and because there have been very large regional floods and very large times when big sea coasts have been covered by tsunamis. And this is important. The flood was sent as judgment. The Biologos article and various other articles I've read by some of these more liberal theologians say, oh, Noah's flood was just about a story of love and grace and judgment. But Noah's flood was sent as judgment, and we can't afford to ignore that. And we need to look at the testimony of Jesus and the apostles. What did they say about it? Because if it was just a local flood, but the way the narrative reads is a global flood, then the global flood story would be just a fairy tale. Now, you can accuse us of believing in fairy tales, but I would be very careful before you accuse Jesus and the apostles of believing in fairy tales. And Jesus has had a lot to say about judgment, because he is not only creator and savior, but he is also the judge. And you can read about some of the things he's said about judgment, particularly as he says that he is coming back as king and judge. And he firmly related his future judgment on the basis of a past judgment. And he says here in Luke 17, but it's also part of a discourse that's recorded in Matthew 24, just as it was in the days of Noah, so it will be also in the days of the Son of Man. So Jesus is linking his future judgment on the basis of something that happened in real history to a real person, to a real world, right? People were eating, drinking, marrying, being given in marriage up until the day Noah entered the ark. Then the flood came and destroyed them all. So Jesus firmly teaches that this was a real event in real history, and therefore you need to be aware that another real event in real history is going to happen. And this is the reason that the skeptics don't want us to believe in a serious judgment. Now, the apostles built on Jesus's teaching, of course, and we have Peter telling us that someday there will be skeptics who will come along and say, oh, the world isn't going to end by Jesus coming. That's a silly story. And why do they say that? Because they deliberately overlooked this fact. Now, notice it's not because of lack of evidence. They are ignoring the evidence that is there, some of the evidence that we've shown you in this program and last week's program. So Peter says they are deliberately ignorant, or they deliberately overlook this fact. And the facts are the heavens existed long ago, and the earth was formed out of water and through water by the word of God. So they are ignoring creation. And then he goes on to say, and that by means of these, that's the waters, the world that then existed was deluged with water and perished. Now, he refers to the whole world was deluged with water and perished. The whole world perished. But by that same word, the heavens and the earth that now exist are stored up for fire. So there will be judgment, but it'll be a different kind of judgment. So God's promise back then in Genesis does hold. Not going to judge by flood, but he will judge by fire, being kept until the day of judgment and destruction of the ungodly. And this is what people are really running away from when they try to scoff at the truth of the scriptures. They're quite happy to argue about creation in terms of design or not design. They are quite happy to look at evidence for floods, but they look at lots of little floods. What they don't want is a creator who is judge and who sent a worldwide judgment and is coming again for a worldwide judgment as well.